Orthodontics is a game of Anchorage. And the purpose of this whole lecture then is to understand mechanics. If you can understand this, the mechanics is self-evident. I don't need to really explain all the details to you if you understand these principles. We said then that as we apply a force onto a tooth, to move it, the first structure to pick up the stress is the fluid within the membrane. Then the next one to pick it up is the tension on the periodontal membrane. But we said under continuous force it stretches. And within 8 minutes the tooth is up against the socket. So then the socket becomes the resistance. And the lamina dura is a small cortical plate. It's cribiform-like because it's so vascular. In the adult, however, it is more compact. And it will give us then a resistance, which explains the lag time. Lag time meaning that there is a time element there before the tooth starts to move after we apply the force, because the cortical plate is a barrier against our movement. If a child falls down and hits a tooth, he's liable to knock it out. If an adult falls down, he's liable to break the tooth off. It's very, very rare that you'll ever have a root tip when you extract a tooth in a child. Say a premolar at the age of 12, there's no problem usually. But extract the first premolar in an upper in an adult. You got those two little roots up there. You've got a lot of root tips. So there's a difference in the differentiation of the alveolar process in the child and an adult. It takes a while in the adult to initiate that movement because of the compact nature of the lamina dura. Now the next line of resistance we see is in the cancellous bone. But due to the fact that it has a high degree of vascularity and medullary bone, cave-like or cancellous, it doesn't offer very much resistance once we're in it. Now the next line of resistance is cortical plates. And very simply, if we want a tooth to move, we want to keep the root away from cortical plates, or what I call cortical avoidance. If it's a situation like that, particularly when we are dealing with the movement of the canine, we have to guide the root in the retraction, not just the crown. We can always upright the tooth later, but if you want to conserve your anchorage, reduce protrusion, which all of you are doing every day, then you have to account for these factors. If I want to then prevent movement of teeth, the anchored teeth that I use, I want to situate them behind cortical plates. Now supposing then I want to skid anchorage, supposing I want to burn anchorage or lose anchorage or displace the molar teeth, then I will just do the opposite. I will let these teeth upright, and as I bring the molars forward, I will also contract them, keep them in the groove. So if I want to move the lower arch forward, I will do everything the opposite. I'll strap up the whole arch. I'll put in round wires. I'll roll these molars up. And then I'll contract the arch. Then I'll put in elastics. And poof! It will go. I have to worry about it extruding. But to get the lower arch forward, I will treat it with round wires. Now let's suppose I want to move a lower arch lingually in class 3. Same principle applies with the lower arch. Keep in mind the cortical plate on the lingual. Keep the posterior teeth away from the cortical plate and let the teeth move back. Prevent the extrusion of them as much as you can, because there's tendency within our maxillary elastics to extrude on both ends. So you don't want patients. I had a patient that came to me. It's very interesting. I examined the child, and it was a grievance case, a grievance suit. lawyer.
Yeah.
You know, it's a grievance. Okay. The parents were suing the orthodontist.
見たのは子供が患者だったんですが。
So I looked at the boy and I was in shock. And so then I had the mother and father come in. And I said, what is your problem? You know, I was trying to defend the orthodontist too. I didn't want to open up the door. It was one of the first patients that the orthodontist had treated after he graduated from USC. So I asked the mother what the problem was, and she said the child has a gummy smile. The only problem was it was his lower gums. He actually smiled. You could not see his upper teeth. And when he smiled, you could see his lower gums. He had intruded the upper teeth so far that he put the occlusal plane clear up above the level of the upper lip. And that I would advise them to go back to the orthodontist, explain what I'm telling them and what their complaint is, and ask him to retreat it. Then I wrote a letter to the orthodontist, but I never heard of it. But that's the end of the story. But the point I'm making here is that here was a case of Anchorage that he'd put a high-pull headgear on all the way through treatment and treated to the level of the lower incisors. And my point is that in Class 3, that's what you, with intermaxillary elastics Class 3, that's a tendency to do that. All right, the next line of resistance is muscle. Most people don't understand it. But if you will notice, when I put a bumper in a case, the lip is so strong that it will move the molars backward. This means that the arch as a whole, engaged against a tight lower lip, is going to be reinforced by that lip. We called them shields before. And I began to use it several years ago and found that it would set a lower denture sometimes too far distally. Once I got the lower arch back that far, it was very difficult to get it forward again sometimes. But we then also, when we have crowded lower dentures, we will put in a group of horizontal loops so that they're engaged against the lip. And so the appliance itself then is offering resistance to the forward movement. It's amazing how the lower molar would be pushed backward from a utility arch with loops down in the vestibule in some of these tight lip cases. My guess is that in the Japanese face, a lot of times you have the narrow mouth and tightness right through here. You have to put a tapered arch in there. But there's a lot of width back here you can take advantage of. Maybe there's an opportunity in some of these patients with these narrow mouths that maybe some people are extracting in, that with utility therapy, loops down here in the gingiva, gentle movement of the molars backward, with tipping of the molars backward, taking advantage of the width that we have in the face, according to that type of face, that maybe 10 to 15% of the cases that are being extracted now could be avoided, and particularly with long-range forecasts, treated to a very, very Japanese, very good Japanese pattern. Because +3 or +4 is not too bad in Japanese face. So maybe there's an opportunity here to intercept these cases earlier, set them up a little bit better, and if you can do it, it's easier to finish cases without extraction. Maybe enucleate third molars, because the odds are you're going to lose them even with extraction in many of those cases. So if you can treat a child that way with third molar extraction, you've saved them 4 teeth. Because the other way, you're going to have third molars out +4 first bicuspids. But it's based on my experience with Japanese faces too. Keep this in mind. So if I can take the same case and treat it non-extraction, it's going to be easier and less chair time than it is with extraction. Now that doesn't mean that you'd be stupid. I mean, if it's an extraction case, then go ahead and make that decision and go ahead and do it. Extraction in that case is the most conservative thing you can do. Now, let's look at the next source of anchorage. We talked about looking around the mouth to procure anchorage. Now what's the next source? Going outside the mouth. Go with extraoral traction for class 3, for class 2, or even class 1. We can use extraoral traction, and I prefer the neck strap. Or in the growth period, we can use it as an orthopedic device, and in the adult case, use it as an orthodontic device. The problem is, it will work, but you have to have superb cooperation and a very dedicated patient. Now, the last thing to throw into the equation is growth. When we start talking about anchorage, growth has to be put in. In one sense, it is a negative feedback. If growth is going to do something for us, it's anchorage we don't have to prepare for. With growth, each year the lower molar moves forward 1 millimeter in space in a horizontal orientation. So it is going to contribute then to the treatment and its anchorage that you don't have to prepare for. The upper molar is doing the same thing. Class 3, it's like you see here. And what I'm showing here is that with 1 degree of rotation of the facial axis, at the distance from 55 millimeters, 1 degree equals 1 millimeter. So 1 degree down here is almost 2 millimeters. So if I rotate it 5 degrees open, I've carried the lower molar 5 millimeters downward and backward. So in Anchorage, we have the periodontal membrane, cancellous bone, cortical bone, muscle, and growth. All right, now I took these from the template that you have with you there, and I did just some rough calculations of the root surfaces. This fits in the American population about 85% of the patients. I'm saying within the pencil line, that's about 85% of all of the cases that we have. Now, Japanese teeth are going to be a little small. So what you do to adapt this is just to do this. Now you've got a shorter root. Now the only thing that I can ask you to do here is to commit to memory these charts. In the direction that we're going to move the tooth, this pretty well represents the cross-sectional area of resistance to bone on face, or in a silhouette shadow. To move an upper incisor, central incisor lingually, it takes 50 grams. Our findings led us to the consideration of 1 gram per square millimeter of root surface. Mira found experimentally that it was 0.8 of 1 gram per millimeter, just slightly less than what I found. But he said with his experimental error that probably 1 gram would be very good hypothesis to use clinically. But if our hypothesis is correct, that 1 gram per square millimeter of root surface is required to move the tooth with the greatest efficiency and health consideration at the same time, and you're avoiding cortical bone, then these values that I have published here are the working hypothesis that I use intraorally. Naturally, if the teeth are smaller, there's less force. These are different directions now. First of all, it takes twice the amount of effort to move a lower central side to side than it does anterior posteriorly, because of the size of the root in the direction you're going to move the tooth. Now study all of those and you'll see then approximately how much force you need to move a tooth in that direction without tipping. Now the next thing on page 514 is to look at the fact that it only takes 85 grams to intrude a first molar. Let's say we have an open bite and we want to intrude posterior teeth. And we want to intrude the upper and lower first molars. How much intruding force do we need? 150 a side, 300 total. So here's the whole idea. It doesn't take much force to intrude a tooth. Look, the key is to make it light and continuous. So memorize these charts so that you'll have an idea of what is required. Now the next problem
それで次です。
is to analyze the force in the wire. What are the wires then, and what is the pull of elastics, and so forth. This is only the starting point. And we will talk about the brackets that we use and the activating mechanisms and analyze the forces
でそれで作動させた時にかかってい
and
る
the
力
direction of the forces
でそれがどの方向にかかっているか
in order to really understand what orthodontics mechanics is all
で
about.
それが
I call this the fixed portion of the apparatus. In your thinking, separate out in technique and put out here the idea of the so-called strap up. The strap up is a term that we use. Like you strap up your belt, like a
バンドを
belt.
締める、はい、
This is a strap, the so-called strap up, the hardware that goes onto the teeth.
なわけです
Now the second part of this is the wire, or what I have chosen to call the activating mechanism. Now, let's get at the brackets and see if I can quickly take you through what this development has been. I'm going to highlight it.
主な
The edgewise bracket was invented in 1928. It was soft and made of gold,
で
and it was numbered in a catalog, number 447. Many of Angle's students didn't like the bracket because it was too soft and made of gold. The old bracket had this design. Now it was too weak right here. And it was made so that you could get a tie under very easily. And this was made in gold,
で
so it was solid. As soon as Angle died,
でアングルがなくなりましたらば
Steiner then designed this bracket,
スタイル
something like that.
まあこんな
This was known as the 458 bracket.
で昔
So this was the one that most people started using. So now I come along in 1955. It didn't have an easy access.
で
So I designed another bracket.
で他のも
At the same time, we narrowed the slot
でまずそのスロットを細くして狭くして深くして
and extended the wing
ウィングをもう少し大きくして
like so.
こういう形に改善しました
This is known as the quick wing.
クイックウィングという名前がついています
So this was the commercial bracket that I modified Steiner's 018,
18
035.
135
Now all bracket slots
でこのスロットというのは
are slightly oversized. Automobile manufacturer knows that you can put a piston in that's the same size that the hole is.
これ
I
そ
mean,
の
if they're exactly the same size, they won't go in. So
で
this
そのブラケット
actually
にやる
is
わ
a
けです
little oversized.
ですからその一番
The idea was, with this bracket,
でこのブラケットは
that I could put a square
なぜこういうふうになっていたかというとここに角線を入れ
and
る
a round wire over the top,
その上にラウンド
or
ワイヤ
vice
ーを
versa.
入れるあるいはその
I've got
丸を下にし
a
て
slot
角線を下に上にしてもよろしいが
I could put a round wire here and a square wire here.
よく似ていま
Now
す
that's the idea behind that design.
強
Now
い
this all happened in 1958
こう
when I was attempting to do all this work.
で
And
こ
at
の
the same time I was working with preformed bands. Nobody up until that time had mounted tubes on bands. We pinched a band, or if it was a preformed, we fitted the band and marked it, and then soldered the tube on, or tack welded the tube on.
で
And what I had come to do is to mount the tubes on the band before I pinched it. I would contour the buccal surface of the band Then I put the band to place
それ
on
から
the tooth
もう一度しがるバンドを
with
乗せ
my
ていって
band forming plier.
でバンドフォーミングプライヤーでつけた
And I would leave it a little bit high,
でちょっと高めにしておいて
just a little bit. How much a little bit? A millimeter above where it was finally going to seat. Then I would pinch it at that position. Now I'm talking about bracket placement, and I want to see if I can save you some time and see if I can get this all over to you in a very precise way. You will notice now that we place
So we can't see anything.
I must be tired. You'll notice now that we place this 2.5 millimeters from the edge of the tooth.
先端から 2.5 ミリです
So this space here is 2.5 millimeters, and when we had the band,
でこれ 2.5 ミリのところにつけます。そう
when
して
we tapped it to seat, it would produce about a 1 to 2 degree mesial tip on the molar, on the central incisor. When I pinch the band, as I will demonstrate to you when we get over at the Palisades, I will demonstrate to you banding and really how rapid
早くできま
and
すから
efficient it is.
非常に効率よくできます
Because I had started tapping all of the gold bands to place.
ゴールドのバンドを全部タッピングでつけていったわけですがそれを
So they'd have that seat.
ピタッと収まる場所に入れる
At that time we were still using the old oxyphosphate cements,
で
and they wouldn't tolerate too much of the space
あんまり
between
そ
the
のスペー
band.
スを取るこ
They'd
とは
come
でき
off
ませんでした
if they were loose.
で緩くなると外れてしまう
So we wanted the band to fit tightly and snugly to be pulled around the tooth, and we drove to the height of contour of the tooth. So now with the steel, we had softened the metal so that we left a tiny bit of adjustment for the band on the tooth by the operator. Now keep in mind this was 58, and the whole profession followed this.
これ
Now, the next thing was, when I was in graduate school, we had 3 instructors, and I placed bands at 3 different heights. If I'd had 6 instructors, I'd probably had 6 heights. I would ask one of them, well, why do you like them there? Why do you want them there?
なぜそこがいいと思うのか
That's where I like them.
そしたらそこがなります
None of them made sense. And one day I sat down and said, wait a minute, let's get some sense out of this. What we're going to do here is to line up proper contact points. So if I put a band here at precisely the marginal ridge on these 2, I'm lining up marginal ridges. That meant then that on all my premolars and my molars,
する場合は
if I have a premolar here like
ここ
so,
に小臼歯があって
and I have a marginal ridge that you can look through here and see this is the depth of the tooth, and then a marginal ridge
で
here.
肺炎瘤線がここにあったと
What
す
I
る
want to do, I want to line that up on the corner of that marginal ridge right there. And as I bend it down, it should fit right snugly.
で
Now, that meant then that if I line all the bands up, forget the bracket.
で
The
今
bracket is standardized.
でブラケットの位置はもう決まってます
If I put the band where it should be, precisely at this marginal ridge,
この辺縁流線にピタッと合うようにつける
the next tooth would be up here,
そうす
and I put that precisely at the
るでこ
margin.
れもや
When I put a straight wire through those 2 marginal ridges are going to line up.
で
So what's all this mystery about so much measuring from the tip of a cusp? One's high, one's short,
高かったり短かったり
one's worn off.
でこうもしてる時間があったりする
So all at once, like that,
良いんです
and seat it by having a girl tap
で
with you
上司の方がいればその人に少し軽く叩いてもらえばいいんです
a gold foil mallet.
叩けばよろしい
Since I'm right-handed,
で私は右利きですから
she had to learn to tap with her left hand.
左があって
When it came to the canine,
剣士
you had a good point on the mesial
ね
to match up with the lateral. So this meant then, to seat one to the fit of the tooth, we had to angulate the bracket. So we counted this 5 degrees when we mounted it on the bracket, on the band. And then as we seated it, we tapped it down on the distal. So it actually was about 7 degrees. 1 to 2 degrees down on the distal and all of these upper teeth here. Occlusion itself has to be understood. And I lay a straight edge. You will notice that there are the canine tip, the buccal and lingual cusp of the first bicuspid, the buccal and lingual cusp of the second bicuspid, the mesial-lingual cusp of the upper first molar, and the distal buccal cusp of the first molar will all be on a straight line. You'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cusps all hitting the table. Once in a while you'll see the upper molar canted buccally. The upper second molar is superior. Purpose B. We're talking about the buccal cusp. The mean was 1.85. This is a distribution on 82 models. So this is the statistics. Only 4 cases out of the whole sample were they on the same plane, with 2 cases as much as 4.5 millimeters up. So when it comes to the second molars, I do not build a flat plane. All right, now here are the upper laterals from this buccal line. Look at the distribution here. So we say the upper laterals should be 1 millimeter. The mean was 1.03. So we say 1 millimeter above the level of this canine, which means the bracket height should be above the level of the bracket height on the canine, 1 millimeter. Now here is the curve of distribution for the upper central. If you notice, it is 0.5 millimeter above. There was only 2 cases in which the incisor was slightly division 2. Now let's look at the lower arch and the lower canine from this buccal line. If you notice, it is in a mean of 1.7 millimeters, so say 1.5 millimeters in the lower canine in from the first bicuspid. Now the lower molar, second molar, from that buccal plane is in 2 millimeters. So when we got the second molar in, we put a little gable bend for that second molar. So you'll see me go in with my plier. This is smaller radius than the old edgewise. I will put a little gable like that, so that this will be moved in about 2 millimeters. So if you notice here, a 2 to 2.5 is what I've been saying for years. In the final occlusion, and when we finish, we're even less than that in all but open bites. We overtreat the open bite down to 4.5 millimeters. There's a tendency for it to open up again. So in deep bites and normal bites, we will finish sometimes at 1 to 1, knowing that within weeks, within days, they will settle into 2 to 2 to 2.5 to 2.5 over jet. Interincisal angle. The more protrusive the bite, the lower the interincisal angle. The more retrusive the bite, the more vertical. In the Caucasian adult occlusion, 130 degrees comes again and again and again. These were measured on these skulls. So we had 30 normal skulls with normal occlusion. The reason I stopped at 30 is because that's a statistical sample. Notice that there tended to be a peak of the curve right here at 130. But the mean was down at 125. When you start looking at these curves, find some all the way down here around 100, and some up in here in 150. That's a range of 63 degrees. So when I began to look at these curves here, I thought we'd better start designing for the pattern of the patient. Now this is the lower canine crown torque. Plus means the crown is labial to the root. The range was minus 13 to plus 23. The mean was plus 1.6. We had been putting plus 7 on the lower canine. So we reduced that down to 2. So we changed that design. The upper canine, I'll tell you, is not been changed. So the upper canine has more labial crown torque or lingual root torque than does the lower canine. This is the distance between the upper molars from side to side, measured on x-rays. The range was a full centimeter, 56 to 66. And when these were corrected for the enlargement in the x-ray at 6%, they came to be 55 millimeters, almost 59. Now remember this. If you get worried when you see one above 55, a lot of people get worried about overexpanding here. These were normal skulls, and we saw them up here at 64 millimeters. Now in malocclusions, you get so conditioned that looking at narrow arches, you think they're normal.